Hi, I'm Weeks Ringel from Modern Quilt Studio. Today we're going to be discussing palette building part 2, how to choose background fabrics to enhance your piecing. Choosing a background fabric is really challenging, especially because you want the fabric to enhance the piecing that you've spent so much time on. So we're going to look at two really helpful strategies today to help you choose a background fabric that will enhance and not overwhelm all of the piecing that you've done in your units, the blocks of your quilt. This advice is helpful for any genre of quilting and any type of quilting. So whether or not you do traditional quilts or modern quilts or art quilts, this advice will be really useful to you. So the first thing we're going to do is look as an example at the background fabric, which is sometimes also called the field fabric, for our Echo quilt made with our Delight fabric line. And if you look at the fabrics used in the Echo quilt, you can see that they are either medium or dark fabrics. So we've set aside the lights among the fabrics for that background fabric. If we had used a medium print or a darker print, you would have had a difficult time seeing the lines that really create the interest in that pattern. So one of the things that you really want to focus on is contrast. And that contrast can be in the form of hue, which is color, or value, which is the lightness or darkness of the fabric, or saturation, which is the brightness or intensity of the fabric. But pattern is also a real consideration. So the first thing I want to do is look at the busyness of fabrics and how you judge different kinds of busyness to determine whether or not they're going to be appropriate for your backing or for your background. So when you are looking for a background, you want to have it really not conflict with the piecing. So it should be in a backup singer kind of role to the piecing that you've put so much time into. So one way to think about it is that if you're in a restaurant and you're having a conversation at conversation level, as I'm talking to you now, if there were really loud music or loud conversations happening next to you, you'd have a difficult time hearing what I'm saying. And background fabrics serve that same role, that you don't want them to overwhelm the piecing. So in the same way you think about background noise as being, it should be at a lower level than the speaking volume, you also want to think about that with the busyness of fabric. So here are some examples that I've arranged of fabrics from not very busy to very busy. So if you look at this first example, this is a desaturated fabric, so it has a lot of gray in it. It's not super bright. So if you put a palette next to that, it would not scream for attention. As you start adding a little bit more pattern and more colors and larger scale prints, you start to get more busyness, and these fabrics start to draw attention to themselves. So if you wanted to use this fabric in it that has lights and darks and a lot of different colors in it, you need to have piecing that's even busier than this, so this fabric wouldn't overshadow it. So when you start looking at contrast between lights and darks, or multicolored prints with saturated colors, these start to be fabrics that are calling more and more attention to themselves. And this very saturated green, it's practically neon, calls a lot of attention to itself because it's much more saturated than the original one I showed you. Now, stripes also love to call attention to themselves, and the most attention is the highest contrast is with black and white. So if you wanted to have black and white in your quilt or as a background in your quilt, you'd want to make sure that the colors are even bolder and the piecing is even bolder. Also, proportion of it, you might be able to get away with a small amount of it, but maybe you wouldn't use a 10-inch by 10-inch piece or have a big striped border unless you really wanted a super loud, super busy quilt. So there aren't rules for this. This is a personal preference, but a lot of it is that your choice of what you're trying to achieve in the quilt. And so looking at the busyness of the background fabric will help you determine how much to use of it and how much the piecing that you've already done or that you're about to do is going to interact with the background fabrics you've chosen. So in general, you want to have a background fabric that's a little less busy, a little less saturated, a little less intense than the fabrics that you've used in the piecing if you want to draw attention to them. So the other thing to think about for choosing a background fabric is the hue or the color. So again, we're going to use 3 words here. Hue, you can see on a color wheel here, which these spokes represent different hues. And then the value, the lightness or darkness of the hue, is on the inside and outside of each spoke. There are an infinite number of spokes you could have, but just for simplicity purposes, we've just have a certain number here so you can generally see the colors more easily. And saturation, which is the purity or the intensity of the hue. Now, if you look at this palette, this is sometimes what we see when people pull palettes and they are trying to use a lot of colors that they like. Sometimes people, especially if they're using solids, will go to another fabric or a painting that they like, that they find inspiring, and they pull colors from, they pull every color in the painting because they like the painting and they assume that they'll like all of these together. Now, I'm showing solids here, but because it's easiest to see the color in solids as opposed to prints, but the same concept goes for prints as well. If you were using this palette in a pattern that also called for a background fabric, you'd be in a little bit of trouble because if you were to make a dot on this color wheel of every hue and value in this palette, you'd fill up the entire color wheel. So the challenge is that if you've got a palette that uses every spoke in the color wheel and then uses a lot, if not all, of the different values in the color wheel, then it's going to be difficult to find a background fabric because that will contrast because you've pretty much used up all of your options. So I want to show you some strategies for editing your palette to make it a little bit more cohesive, but to also to leave room for a background fabric. So one of the ways we could do that would be to look at eliminating one level of values. So let's just say that we were going to, instead of using all of the values, we were going to eliminate just the darks. So if you were to draw a line So you'd start by removing these darks. So this is sort of a medium, but so I'd maybe leave that in, but these super darks, and you can see how many more options you're going to have. Actually, I'm going to pull out even more to make it a little bit easier to see. So you can start to see that when you pull out more darks, you could use any of these as an option as a background fabric. Let's just say you wanted this dark brown. You'd have good contrast with all of the other fabrics in the palette because you haven't used every single one. Now, let's just say that you wanted to keep the darks in. So let's put them back in and let's look at what it would look like if you removed the lightest ones because you wanted to use them as a background fabric. So I'm just putting these in a kind of random order just to break it up. So I'm not organizing them by hue yet, and I might do that in a minute. But we're just going to put these back in so we can see what it would look like if you decided to eliminate all of the lights. So let's take out the lightest fabrics, because then that would make these lights. So we're going to do the opposite of what we did, which is we're going to draw a circle around these values. And then we'll say we're not going to use them. These are going to be background options. So let's just remove a bunch of the lights so you can see how much, that's probably a medium, that could probably stay in there. Well, I think the way to tell would be if the light looks good. I think that gray is a little bit too light. So you can see that you have good contrast, although these are still bugging me. Now you can see that the value is going to work because you have eliminated enough lights that you can get enough contrast to be able to have a lighter fabric as a background. Now let's arrange the palette by hue. So instead of deciding that we're going to use the entire palette, let's maybe decide that we're going to limit some of the hues. How about we take out, let's see, why don't we take out the oranges, for example? So we're just going to remove these oranges and golds. So if we take out, and then remember the dark yellow is brown. So that would have to go as well. All of these golds. So now you can see this green is just, it's just a little tricky, but you can see that once we've taken out the oranges, if you wanted to use a brown Oh, I forgot this brown, these browns. That's what I was looking for. So now that we've taken out the yellows and the golds, you can see that this espresso brown would work beautifully as a background fabric because you've limited the number of hues in the quilt. So there isn't a formula to it. It's just more a matter of having some kind of constraint. So you're making a place within your palette for a background fabric to give contrast to your palette. Now, another option would be to look at saturation. So let's look at what if you decided to take out all of the brights in the quilt and you just left desaturated colors. So I'm going to put a couple of these desaturated colors back in, some of these browns and golds, and I'm going to take out all of the brights. So this and this, and it sounds like it would be a really boring quilt, but it's actually really, really beautiful and subtle when you start to take out the most, I'm going to do the whole thing. Let's see. I think this is going to have to go too. Yep, now that I'm thinking about it. These pinks and greens. Let's just do the whole thing as real neutrals. And then you can see, and again, neutrals don't need to always be gray. They can be ochre or green, or this kind of peacock blue is a good one also. But you're starting to see this is a really handsome quilt. Actually, maybe even that blue can work in there. So now you've got a desaturated palette, and you could look and take out this blue, for example, and that could be a really beautiful palette, a background fabric there as well. Now, because this is a desaturated blue, this would work, but this is the example of what's not going to work. If you were to take, this is the kind of, if you're in the restaurant and somebody's speaking with a very loud noise at the table next to you, that's what this pink would look like. Even if you had beautiful, beautiful piecing with all of these neutrals, if you had a hot pink background, that would just scream, and that would be all you would notice. So again, what you want to do is think about the palette. If you've got a pattern that needs a background fabric as well as a palette, you want to look at the piecing and the fabrics that you're going to be using in the main palette and make sure that whatever fabric you use in the background doesn't overwhelm it. If you decide that you really love a busy background fabric, make sure that the fabrics that are in the main palette are even stronger, because sometimes you can mix these really bold and bright and busy fabrics together, but you really want to make sure you have enough contrast. So if you're going to use a busy fabric in the background, you want to have value contrast or hue contrast or scale contrast or something. So the background fabric, like a background noise in a restaurant or someplace else, doesn't overwhelm the beautiful piecing that you've done in the main part of the quilt. So if you look again at the Echo quilt, you'll see that we use the lightest gray. If you're using a lot of different colors, you can't use all colors and all values and all saturations because there'll be nothing left for the background. So we set aside this super light gray to be able to use that to have good contrast in Echo. Now this applies to sashing and traditional quilts. We could have gone the other direction and used lights and mediums in Echo and then had a dark background. That's another option. So if you look in this party of four, what you're looking at is, and you might think of as sashing, is still a background fabric. So depending on the design of the quilt, sashing may or may not include background fabric. Usually we think of background fabric as something where there's a large amount of it, but it can also include sashing. So again, you want to look at, in this party of 4, where we're using one fabric for both the sashing and the background, you can see that we were very careful with the value to make sure that there wasn't any confusion between the fabrics in the main palette and the background fabric.